Welcome, everyone. We'll give everybody just a moment to come into the waiting room. Bear with us for just a second. Okay. Hello, everyone. I think we are ready to begin. Welcome to today's In My Own Words program series. And I'm so excited that so many of you are joining us today from all around the world. My name is Lisa Bachman, and I'm the Senior Director of Operations at the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida. We're located just north of downtown Orlando, and we do hope that when you have a chance to visit our city beautiful, that you'll make a stop, put us on your list, and come and visit us in person. Our mission is to use the history and lessons of the Holocaust to build a just and caring community free of anti-Semitism and all forms of prejudice and bigotry. One of the ways in which we live our mission is through storytelling. And today, we've got an incredible story for you. Not only are we going to hear the story of a Holocaust survivor, but we're also going to hear about the heroism of a young man who sprung into action to save so many lives. And as a result, this program is happening today. I would like to extend very deep gratitude to Tamara Meyer, who made this program possible. Tamara is an author, lecturer, and media consultant. She's the daughter of German Jewish parents who escaped Nazi Germany at the brink of World War II. For the past 2 decades, she has been lecturing and writing about her family legacy. I'll never forget the night when she first reached out and we had a phone call. And although I was meeting her for the first time, we talked for more than an hour, and I felt like I was talking with a longtime dear friend. So because Tamara was so instrumental in putting this program together, in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce our incredible speakers. But first, I have just a bit of housekeeping. Our speakers will be taking questions towards the end of the program. At any time throughout the program, please make sure to put your questions into the chat, and we will do our very best to answer as many as time permits. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Tamara Meyer.
Hello, everyone. I am so happy to be here, and I'm honored to be here. Lisa, thank you so much. I want to just mention a few words about the subject matter today. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Kindertransport and then introduce our 2 wonderful speakers. At the brink of World War II, the United Kingdom acted quickly to save 10,000 Austrian and German Jewish children from the grips of the Nazi regime, while the rest of the world stood still and complacent. The Kindertransport rescue mission is the story of parents making a heartbreaking decision to save their children's lives by sending them to strangers in a foreign land, knowing they would likely never see them again. It is also a story of children surviving and creating new lives for themselves after living through an unthinkable tragedy. My mother was one of those children. Today, we will be speaking about Sir Nicholas Winton, who organized a separate Kindertransport from Czechoslovakia. I'm honored to be here with 2 close friends, his daughter, Barbara Winton, and Kim Masters, daughter of one of Nicky's rescued children. We were brought together given our shared legacy of the Kindertransport. Barbara Winton is the daughter and biographer of the late Sir Nicholas Winton, who organized the Czech and Slovak Kindertransport that rescued 669 endangered children from the Nazi threat just months before the outbreak of the Second World War. Sir Nicholas was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in 2003 for services to humanity. Barbara wrote his biography, If It's Not Impossible, which I have here, and The Life of Sir Nicholas Winton, which was published in 2014. Since then, Barbara has continued to give talks about her father's work, its impact today, and how his legacy can be continued. She has formed the Sir Nicholas Winton Memorial Trust to hold his archives for educational use into the future. Alongside this, she campaigns for the rights of today's refugees, especially children, in particular supporting the work of Safe Passage and Lord Alf Dubs, himself a Czech Kindertransport survivor and one of Nikki's children. We call him Nikki. Kim Masters is editor-at-large of The Hollywood Reporter and host of KCRW's The Business. She is also the daughter of one of the children Sir Nicholas Winton rescued during the Holocaust. A former correspondent for NPR, she has also served as a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, Time, and Esquire, and was a staff reporter for the Washington Post. She is the author of The Keys to the Kingdom, The Rise of Michael Eisner and the Fall of Everybody Else, and co-author with Nancy Griffin of Hit and Run, How John Peters and Peter Guber Took Sony for a Ride in Hollywood. Masters was named Entertainment Journalist of the Year by the Los Angeles Press Club in 2001 and Print Journalist of the Year by the Los Angeles Press Club in 2012. Her show, The Business, received Gracie Awards for Outstanding Talk Show in 2012 and 2014. In 2018, the Greater Los Angeles chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists gave Masters its Distinguished Journalist Award. Now I'm happy to present Kim Masters and Barbara Winton.
Thank you very much, Tamara, and I'm very happy to be here and happy to be here with Barbara, who is a very good friend, as you said. I am going to start out just by setting the table a bit of the history of how Nikki Winton came to be a hero to so many people. And it's really quite it's a tale with twists, I will say. We will go back to 1938, and this is a time when Hitler is coveting Czechoslovakia. There's young Nikki. At that time, Nikki was a stockbroker. He was in London. Hitler, meanwhile, persuades Chamberlain to hand over, in the infamous Munich Agreement, to hand over this area of Sudetenland, which you can see there. If you see Czechoslovakia towards the center there, there's a bordering territory in a kind of mauve color. That is a territory that had many German-speaking residents, and Hitler he had agents agitating for years before, because it takes time to advance fascism. He had Germans agitating and creating discontent in that part of Czechoslovakia. And ultimately, as I said, the British handed over half of it, and Hitler then, of course, was not appeased and wanted to occupy it, and he wanted all Czech-speaking people expelled. And late in September 1939, the Munich Agreement was reached. No consultation with the Czech government, just handed over to Hitler. And Winston Churchill said to the prime minister at the time, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." And that, of course, is exactly what happened. In March 1939, Hitler annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia. And this is where we start to see refugees from Sudetenland pouring into the rest of Czechoslovakia, or what was Czechoslovakia, and where Nikki Winton gets a call. He was planning a ski holiday, but he gets a call from a friend. And Barbara, why don't you pick it up from there and explain what Nikki then did?
Okay, so as Kim said, my father was living a normal life in London at the time. He was very interested in what was going on in Europe, and despite being from kind of middle class, right-wing family, if you like, conservative family, he was very interested in politics and in social justice, and was a member of the British Labour Party. And so he was very concerned about what was happening in Europe and what was happening to people who were being threatened with violence and all the things that were going on post-Kristallnacht. He was due to go on a skiing holiday with a friend of his, in December, and he got a phone call from that friend, a man called Martin Blake, who said, I'm in Prague, the skiing holiday's cancelled, I think you should come out and see what I'm up to. And so a week later on New Year's Eve, my father arrived in Prague, was met by Martin, who introduced him immediately to a woman he was working with called Doreen Warrener, who was another volunteer who had gone out post-Munich to see what she could do to help with the situation of the refugees who had fled from the Sudetenland. She was very concerned about, these are some of the people who helped my father and who my father was involved with at the time. So on the top left here, you'll see Doreen Warrener. And her job was to get the politicians, the people from the Sudetenland who had spoken out against Hitler and were already on his wanted list, out of Czechoslovakia altogether, because his agents were already in Prague trying to get hold of these people. And Martin was helping her do that. And my father met her and she encouraged him to go and see what was going on. So he went around the city. He saw, thousands of people wandering around with nowhere to go, nowhere to stay, nowhere to get out, not enough money. And he, was obviously very shocked by what he was seeing. She sent him out to look at the refugee camps because many of the people who had fled were staying in makeshift refugee camps around the city of Prague. And it was the middle of the winter, it was January, snow on the ground, people who had fled from their homes with one day's notice and really had nothing with them. And he thought, this is appalling, these people can't stay like this. They've got no hope, no future, nothing, nowhere to go. And so he came back and said to Doreen, I can see all these different organizations who are working to support the refugees, but nobody's focusing on the children. And I think I'd like to fill that gap if it's possible. While he was there, he met Trevor Chadwick, the next person on the top line there, who was a schoolmaster from England who'd come out from his school to sponsor 2 refugee boys to take back to his school to look after. And Trevor, hearing that Nicky was going to try and do something to help children get out of Czechoslovakia, said, well, if you do manage to get the British government to agree, you'll have to have someone, the Czech end, while you're in London. And so let me know if you succeed and I'll come back and do that. So all these other people in the picture, Bill Barazetti was a refugee who worked for Doreen Warrener. Marie Schmolka was a Czech who did a lot of work for refugees, particularly Orthodox Jewish children. And the bottom line, Beatrice Wellington also worked with Doreen. Barbara Winton, my grandmother, who I'm named after, was my father's first volunteer. He volunteered her to help him. And the 2 at the bottom, the Reverend Rosalind Lee and Eleanor Rathbone, were 2, British women who did an awful lot in the UK to bring to notice the plight of the refugees and to try and get the government to do more to help and to get families to bring in children.
Yes, so it's really, this was not such a simple task. You had to find people who would sign for these children and provide money that I think in modern day currency would have been about $4,600 guarantee. It was £50 at the time, but if I did the math right, which is probably questionable, it's about $4,600. So you had to have find strangers and many who were just willing to find these children a home. And you had to get the British government, and Nicky, of course, Barbara attempted to get many other governments, including the United States government, to help with no success whatsoever.
Well, as he was told by Doreen and many others, that they didn't think the British government would respond because they'd already agreed to let in these large numbers from Germany and Austria. But his view was that he was going to try. And despite the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, when he got back to London, they said to him, don't go to the Home Office and ask separately. They'll only be annoyed. Just wait sooner or later the other organization will let in the children. But he went anyway, and he asked the Home Office, and they said, sure, you can bring in children. You have these two conditions. One is that you have to find a family for each child. And the other thing is you have to provide a £50 guarantee, as Kim said, a large sum of money at the time, which will pay for their repatriation. So at that point, he knew he had a project on the go, and he sent Trevor a message, and Trevor went back to Prague. He did write to other governments. As you can see there, there's a letter that he wrote to President Roosevelt, which was unknown for many years, and only a few years ago, someone in the National Archives in Washington found this letter in the archives. So it was fantastic to see the letter that my father wrote to President Roosevelt. And in the scrapbook that he has, was given as a memento after the project, there are some of the replies that came from the American embassy and from various American committees explaining why they were so sorry, but they weren't going to be able to help. And apart from Sweden, that took a small number of children, he couldn't get any other countries to help. So it was all down to Britain taking in 10,000 children.
Yes, I'll talk about my family for a minute. My mother lived in a very small village in Czechoslovakia. I've been there, and I sometimes say I don't know how anyone got out of there, even if there wasn't a Hitler, because it's very remote. And how you would go from a tiny, tiny village of Tristana out would be a mystery, except we know that my mother's uncle, he worked at one of the spas in Czechoslovakia, and they dispatched him to Berlin at one point, and he was a witness to what was happening in Berlin, and they then moved him to London, and he was married to a German woman who was a musician and an artist, and we can only surmise that through this German woman, through the circle of friends, these musicians and artists, they connected somehow to what Nicky was doing. And he then, my mother's uncle, wrote to his sister in Czechoslovakia and said, you have to get out. And if you can't get out, you have to get your children out. And, you know, my mother's and her sisters the oldest was just shy of a birthday that would have disqualified her from being eligible to be on one of Nicky's trains. And the youngest was my Aunt Ellie. She was 10 years old at the time. It's become kind of an iconic story, as I think Barbara and Tamara know, how my grandmother sewed, and my mother still has these embroidered nightgown that she made, and the dress and the things that she made for her girls before putting them on this train. People in the village thought that was, and most of them thought, you're absolutely crazy. What are you doing? Keep the family together. But my grandparents they really were smart, sophisticated, lucky, connected to someone in London who knew what was going on. I mean, just the luck of it. That's why I'm here, in terms of just the long odds against it. And so my grandmother and grandfather, my aunt has talked about how she saw her father crying for the first time in her life when they were taking the girls to the train. And Ellie, my youngest aunt, was quite a frail child. And my grandmother, Sidonia, was extremely torn about putting her on that train. And as my mother and her, as they told the story many times, they put her on the train and then they handed her back off because my grandmother changed her mind. She said, I can't do it. I can't put this little 10-year-old on the train. And then they decided they really had to put her back on the train because, of course, they knew that things were so dire. And my mother and her sister were saying, keep her, as adorable siblings will do. But thankfully, my grandmother put her on the train. And that story has been told in film. And you know, my mother and her sisters didn't know for many years how this came to be, who was responsible for this amazing rescue. But Barbara, let's go back to what Nicky was doing in London, the letters and the papers he had to compile and the photos, an enormous amount of paperwork and bureaucracy that he had to carve through.
Yes, I think people think that once he'd decided that he was going to do it, that it was kind of job done. But actually, as you say, there was a huge amount of work. And because he was kind of an administrator and a banker by profession, he was used to keeping meticulous records. He had to keep records of all the children and of all the families. There were no computer spreadsheets. He had to get the money. He had to plead for money. He had to write to newspapers and magazines and ask people to come forward to take children. And, this was at a time when, people had just got through the Great Depression and there wasn't a lot of money about in the country. And, gradually families did come forward, and even people who had very little money and very little to offer took children in, and some of them even sent their own children to relatives so that they had a room to bring in a refugee child. So the sacrifices that the foster families made were enormous as well, and it was an extraordinary effort. And through the spring and summer of 1939, 8 transports bringing these 669 children came into the UK. Of course, the Germans, as you said, Hitler broke his word as the Sudetenland being his last territorial ambition, and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia on the 15th of March. And that was the day after the first transport had left. So after that, Trevor was working with the Gestapo. They had to stamp the exit visas and allow the children out. But as far as they were concerned, they weren't too worried about that. They were keen to arrest the adults who were against them. But their view at the time was that they wanted to rid Europe of Jews. And as far as they were concerned, if Trevor and my father wanted to help them do that, they were kind of okay with that. So they didn't make it too difficult. I mean, there were problems, but they basically allowed them out. And a lot of the problems was waiting for the Home Office to provide the entry visas, which every child had to have to come into the country. They had to have an entry permit, which had to be stamped by the British government and then by the Gestapo. And this was something that they had to have on them when they came through. Yes, it's the next picture, I think. Yes. So this is the entry permit of a girl called Judith Keller, now Judith Hawkins, who kindly allowed me to use this visa. So every child who came had one of these, and they were all stamped, and they allowed them into the country. And if the British government were very slow in getting the visas ready, the trains were there in Prague, ready to go. They couldn't wait. They couldn't say, well, we haven't got a visa. So one of the things that Trevor had to do from time to time was he found a kindly Czech printer who would print some fake visas for the Germans to stamp in the hope that when they arrived on British soil, the correct ones had arrived from the British government and they could swap the fake ones for the real ones, which I was assured happened. So they came in legally, but sometimes things had to be sped up a bit to keep the show on the road.
Yes, Nikki would not, none of them we weren't going to let little bureaucracy have like that mess up the proceedings. The reason I think that this musician relative of ours is the key to the connection is that Dame Myra Hess, who was a famous British pianist, signed for 100 children, and 2 of those were my aunts. My uncle was able to sign for my mother, his favorite, I think, and the 2 of my aunts were Myra Hess. And there's a play about that. Some of you may be aware of one of the other children who became not a Czech child, but she became a protege. Maybe remembering that wrong, but she definitely became a protege of Myra Hess and a classical pianist, and she does a wonderful play. So the names of Trevor and Doreen are ones I want you to remember, and I'll explain that shortly. But what happens is the story of Nikki falls into obscurity after the war. And Barbara and I both feel that and Nicky himself felt that there was a lot of myth that became built up around Nicky. But Barbara and I and Nicky, when he was alive, I did an interview with him. With my mother and my daughter and I went to visit him, and we were his 3 generations of children, a child, grandchild, and great grandchild, which I think he was very taken with my daughter, who was about 9 years old, because he loved children and they were adorable together. But he talked about the frustration of the myths. But before we get to the myths, let's go to the silence of, I think, many years that happened. And it was not as the myth would have it, because Nicky didn't tell anybody about this, right? It was because people weren't interested. That's what he told me. Barbara, yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, I think the other thing was that he was somebody who always had a current project on the go.
Right.
So there were 2 things. One was there was a final train that was prepared for the 1st of September 1939. It was going to be the biggest transport they'd organized, 250 children. And that was the day that the Germans invaded Poland, and they closed the borders and the train wasn't allowed to leave. So that train was cancelled and all the children were sent back to their families. Most of them ended up with their families in Terezin and ended up finally in Auschwitz. So that was a huge trauma for everybody involved, that this huge transport had been cancelled, and they obviously were deeply worried about what had happened to that. And I think that had an impact on him. But
also, I'll just point out, Barbara, sorry, that of course they knew each of these children individually. It wasn't just an idea of a group of children. They had all those papers prepared. They knew who those kids were. It was extremely real.
Yeah. Oh yes, absolutely. And so my father really had to. They all had to stop on that project at the time. I mean, my grandmother, who was helping, she went on with the aftercare, but my father went into the war. That very first picture you saw of him was in his Red Cross uniform in 1940. And so he went on into the war. He had 6 years of war. He was in the RAF. After the war, he worked for the International Refugee Organization in Geneva, helping with the repatriation and other events around the end of the war. And then he went on with his life. And he always had something on the go that was the most important thing at the time. And he wasn't really someone who dwelt on the past. As you said, it wasn't that it was a secret. It was that it wasn't really something that people talked about. And many Holocaust survivors themselves say that nobody really wanted to, even if they wanted to talk about it, nobody really wanted to talk about it. And it took a couple of generations really, till the 80s, till the Kindertransport children, who were in their 50s and 60s by then, began to look back at their lives and wonder about it. And that was the point at which my father also felt perhaps this scrapbook that he'd been given of all the reports and stories and pictures from that time, you know, maybe an organization would be interested in this. Maybe this was the time to pass this information on as a historical document.
As he told me, he had tried to give it away before and had no takers. I wonder, Barbara, when you grew up with Nicky involved in all these projects, did you have an awareness that he had even done this, or was this something you didn't know about as children?
Well, people always ask me when we first knew about it, and I really can't remember when, but certainly in our teens we would have known about it. And I know in my early 20s, I was showing the scrapbook to people I had some friends who I lived with who worked at the Israeli embassy, and I remember showing it to them and saying, you know, do you think anybody would be interested? So you know, we were all aware of it at the time. I think the issue was that for us, it was a document, it was paper, it was history. It was only when the children saw the document, when they came into the picture as living, breathing people, that the story became not a piece of history to us, but something real and living.
Oh, you're bringing me to this pivotal moment in 1988, I think, where BBC, and we're going to talk about this, but we're going to play this clip of when there was a program on the BBC where, as you will see, Nicky was invited and surprised and not warned in advance that he was going to be a subject of, that his story, his World War II story, was about to be revealed. And here's the clip.
Can I ask, is there anyone in our audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton? If so, could you stand up, please?
Okay, so I defy you to see that without getting tears in your eyes. Two of those women right behind Nikki are my Aunt Yoshi and my Aunt Ellie, the little one that almost got taken off the train. So every time I see them there, I get a little emotional myself, but bear with me. So that is a beautiful moment in many ways, but Barbara, for your family, it was kind of a shocking moment. Nikki was not expecting it. And it changed your lives.
Yes, I think it really did. I mean, it wasn't a tsunami. It was kind of waves, and it came in waves, and people would phone up and letters would arrive and people would turn up, and it would happen over periods of time. In the first year, there was a conference that was organized about the Holocaust, and my father was invited to it, and he met there many of the children who really, once this program went out, this program that they showed a clip of just now, That's Life, this was watched by nearly half the British population at the time. There was not that much TV, and so, you know, within a week, people were phoning each other, people who had been refugees together, who knew about each other's stories, saying, did you see that program? You know, that must have been how we came. Do you know? Should we find out? Writing to the BBC, they writing to my father. And so it kind of gradually over time, it built up. And people started coming to look at my father's scrapbook and to look at their names, because at the back of the scrapbook was a list of the names of all the children who had come and the foster families who had taken them in. And they wanted to look at this because many of them had no idea how they'd come to be brought to the UK, how they came to be chosen, how they'd gone to the families that they had, and to have someone who was the link to their history. Of course, many of them had lost their parents and all their family and not seen any of them again. And so my father was the link back to their families. So for them, when they came and met my father, it was hugely emotional. And suddenly, as I said, you know, for us, this document that we'd looked at for many years going, ooh, you know, that's quite interesting, isn't it? You know, that's an interesting story from history. Suddenly it was these people's lives and they were coming in and the emotion arrived in the room with them. And we suddenly understood, you know, this person wouldn't have been here if not for this episode, and their child who they brought with them wouldn't have been there either. So for many years, well, until my father died in 2015, aged 106, he continued to meet many of the children. Many of them became close friends, including Kim's mother. And, you know, he was always delighted to meet them, talk to them about what they'd done with their lives and what they were interested in. He was, you know, particularly interested in what people did all over the world and to hear what was going on with them. And for him, it was, my mother died in 1999. So for him to have this huge new family developing was very important to him in his later years, because many of them lived nearby and became part of his wider family.
Yes, I'm going to introduce one of the kinder in a second, but I would just mention that he came to accept this hero role kind of gradually, and he didn't like the gilding of the lily. And I think when he first came, well, my mother went to a meeting of kinder. It's funny how things happen. I was writing for the Washington Post at the time. This was a meeting in London, her first such meeting where she was learning who had saved her. And I got a reporter in London to do a piece for the Post, which was then seen by a filmmaker who wasn't one of Nikki's kids, but was a Kindertransport kid. And she made an Oscar-winning film, Into the Arms of Strangers, having seen the article in the Post. So it's funny how things work out. But we connected and found out that the article I had caused to be written about my mother going to this thing was the inspiration. Nikki came to visit us quite early on in this whole thing, and in Washington, D.C. I will mention my family, my mother never saw her parents again. They were killed in concentration camp. But Nikki came, and my father said to me, "You're a reporter, and I want you to get him to talk about this, because we want to know more," because it was sort of a story coming out. We didn't really know the whole thing at that time. And Nikki was very reluctant. And I think my father got mad at me because I didn't want to hound him through the whole meal. So I did back off. But I think the two reasons are that lost train that didn't get through, maybe, and the fact that he felt that the others, the Doreens and Trevor and those other who were on the ground, that he was getting a lot of credit because he was around and alive, and the hero could be thanked, and they were being forgotten. I don't know, Barbara, is that your take on it?
Well, my father was a very stubborn, cussed sort of guy. He had to do what he did. I mean, when I talk to school children about it, I emphasize his anti-authoritarian position.
I think I inherited that from him.
Yeah, he was very keen to do what he thought was the right thing, and he didn't really care what other people thought often. And also he was incredibly stubborn and determined. And if you didn't approach him in quite the right way, or he was feeling a bit or whatever, there was no way you would get him to say. And yet the next day, on a different moment, he might have just gone with the whole thing. You could never tell with him. You could never second guess my dad. He was always completely his own person, and completely impossible to predict how he would react. But he believed very much in a strong ethical code in how you should live your life. He believed that the best way to live a meaningful life was to spend some of your time helping other people in need. And he believed, he spent his whole life doing that, not in so, dramatic fashion, in much more simple local fashion many times. But when he was kind of applauded and told what a wonderful person he was doing all this charity work, he would say, "But I'm selfish. I do it because I enjoy it. And I think anybody else who took the trouble to spend some of their time doing things in their community and helping others would find it very meaningful and a wonderful way of spending your time." So that was just how he was. He really enjoyed helping people and doing things for people, and he enjoyed being with people. He was a humanitarian, and he loved people.
Through and through. Yes, luckily for me, on the second visit, he was more forthcoming. And he did say that some of this made up aspects that about him never talking about it, and the book being discovered in the attic because nobody knew. He said it made him distrust history, and he didn't care for that. But I think my sense was at a certain point he knew that we needed a hero in world, and we needed him. And he deserved the acclaim he got. He didn't need to, the story doesn't need to be gilded, because the story is fantastic and great. And as to your comment, Barbara, about his view of life and how people should live, I'm going to bring in Eva Paddock, who is joining us. She is one of Nikki's children. She got to know Nikki, and I know, Eva, you can tell us just a little about meeting Nikki, and you had a quote of his that you wanted to share.
Yes, I met Nikki late after the show, as many people did, and because I was going to be meeting everybody today, I happened to look up something on my archive that I use when I go out to schools and speak, because my view of the heroism is to let children know that any one person can make a difference. And this is the quote that I have. The difference one can make. There is a difference between passive goodness and active goodness, which is, in my opinion, the giving of one's time and energy in the alleviation of pain and suffering. It entails going out, finding and helping those in suffering and danger, and not merely leading an exemplary life in the purely passive way of doing no wrong. And I think that totally speaks to who Nicky was, in my opinion, and his action in words. Get out and do something. Don't just, lead what you consider to be a pure life. So thank you for allowing me to let people hear that.
Of course, a wonderful quote. And Barbara, that brings us to a point that I know is of such importance to you and Lord Alf Dubs, which is we have ongoing refugee crises in this country, in your country, in Europe. And what we see is not what the goodness of Nicky Winton. We see, in some we do. Lord Alf Dubs, as a kind himself, has given his time, energy, resources to this. But we see there's also a lot of disappointment that people don't take the lessons that Nicky taught to heart, I think.
Well, I think there's two things there. One is that it's very easy for politicians today to honor people from history, like my father. My father eventually, was given, luckily he lived long enough to receive them, to get some of these honors, and was applauded by members of various governments, the British, the Czech, the Slovak governments, and so on. And they were very keen to appreciate what he had done to help child refugees. What I find rather dispiriting is that the same politicians were refusing to help today's child refugees while they were applauding my father for helping yesterday's. And yes, we could all say that the circumstances are different and it's not the same, but when my father went into the refugee camps around Prague and saw children stuck there, he wasn't psychic. He had no premonition that if he didn't do something for these children, they were going to be murdered. He thought that the conditions they were living in, with not enough to eat, no education, no future, that these conditions were terrible enough to warrant him rescuing them. And these conditions are similar to what we see today in refugee camps around the world. So I think there is room to make comparisons, that what the response he made to the situation he saw was very similar to some of the situations we see today. And of course, there are thousands of wonderful people who are behaving today like my father did then, who are giving their time to help, their neighbors, refugees, people in all kinds of situations. And those were the kind of people my father admired and felt were living a good life, living a proper life, where you actually give something back to other people. And of course, I think one of the things we discovered when we met many of my father's refugee children was that an impulse that many of them had was that they needed to pay back, that they had been given something precious. They had been given an opportunity to live, and they were going to make the most of that. And one of the ways they were going to do that was to help other people. And I've heard that time and time again when I've talked to the kinder. I'm sure Eva knows this very well, that there is this sense of wanting to contribute something positive to the world, because here I am, I've had the opportunity that others didn't get, and I'm going to make the most of it.
Absolutely. I am going to thank you, Barbara, and I think Tamara, you've been collecting questions from our audience, if you want to go to some of those.
I would like to introduce my sister. She and I were two of Nicky's children, and we absolutely all feel ourselves to be Nicky's children. I mean, that's who we are. And my sister is Milena Granville-Bain. She's visiting us from England. And the two of us were on one of Nicky's trains. So it's quite a family meeting today.
Yes. You were very small, right, at that time? You don't have a memory of that.
I was 3.5. Milena was 9, 6 years older than me. Yeah.
I mean, my mother remembers, you know, she remembers thinking it was a bit of a lark. I mean, they knew their parents were upset, but they were excited about going on a train. And she does remember the people in Holland handing them hot chocolate through the window of the train. I don't know if your sister had that experience, but my mother always would certainly be one to remember chocolate whenever it came their way in life.
Well, I think the effect was different at children of different ages. But anyway, just because of the program, I wanted people to know that we are two of Nicky's family.
Yes. Tamara, what about the question? Are you giving us the questions?
Yes, I'll be giving you some questions. And I love this question from Serena Ahmed, who also works for the Holocaust Museum that's hosting this wonderful event. I love this question. What lesson on the work of Sir Nicholas Winton do you want to make absolutely sure the community leaves here with today? So Barbara and Kim, I think that's a good question.
Well, I guess I would say, if you see something that is wrong, that needs doing, don't look around, wait for someone better qualified, more important, more whatever than you to do it.
Right.
Do it yourself. Find some people, like-minded people, get together, get it done.
You know, for me, I'm sort of struck by one of the things that Barbara said, that Nicky wasn't psychic and didn't know these children would be murdered if he didn't save them. But we've seen what happened in World War II and what happened to the children who weren't saved and their families. And what we see today in the world, I think, should alarm everybody. History being erased, the truth being rewritten or written out of history. A real actual war on truth. You know, I'm a journalist. I have that my whole job is to get things right. And it stung me when Nicky said to me when we did that interview that he can't trust, the newspapers keep adding. He said, every time they tell my story, they add, and it makes me distrust history. And I feel that aside from doing the kind of work that Barbara's referencing, we also have to fight for truth. And that's a lesson that I hope everybody takes away from this. I don't know if Eva has anything to add there, but that's my feeling.
What Barbara said is exactly what my message would be. Don't wait for somebody else, just do it. And forget the rules. Set the course yourself.
And just to show Barbara's book again, Nicky's words, if it's not impossible. And I've just heard this from Barbara and from Barbara, I think from some of your cousins also, that Nicky always said, if it's impossible, you said, I think to me, if it's impossible, so be it. But if it's not impossible, there has to be a way. Just to echo what all of you were saying. There's another question here that I think is very apt, given what Kim just shared. And it has to do with someone who is researching the Kindertransports. This is something that comes up quite a bit. The terms refugee and evacuee are used interchangeably. Do any of you have a view, preference, opinion about these terms? I think they do mean something different in the United States versus in England and in Europe. Would anyone like to take that?
Well, I mean, a refugee is an international term. It has a strict terminology as to what it means. It is someone who is fleeing and needs sanctuary because of threats of violence against and danger in the country that they've come from. But an evacuee can mean, I mean, we had evacuees in our country in 1939 who were children who were evacuated from the cities into the countryside. So, an evacuee, I think, is a broader term, whereas a refugee is a kind of a protected terminology, if you like.
Well, I have my own. What about asylum seeker? Has that ever been used in this regard?
I think, an asylum seeker is someone who is looking for refugee status, because refugee status is a status that should mean that your government gives certain protections and certain help to that individual. And that's why, certainly in Britain, the word asylum seeker is used all the time, because it's considered, it's considered by the tabloids as someone who's coming to try and get something that they don't deserve, I guess is the way it's being put. I mean, the interesting thing about the Kindertransport and today is that the same newspapers who today denigrate asylum seekers, refugees, immigrants, are the same newspapers who in 1939 said, we don't want these Jewish people coming into our country, taking our jobs. I mean, the headlines from then are appalling, and as appalling as they are today. And the story hasn't changed. There were people against it then. It wasn't as though the whole country welcomed these, people with open arms. There was the same pushback as there is today. But the point is that there were enough people who had it in that sense of humanity in their hearts, that sense of compassion to do the right thing. And I think those people are there today as well. But it's the way the media portrays it that makes it seem like, nobody wants to help people in need, it's not our problem, let someone else deal with it.
Well, I will point out, for example, in this country, our media, Jacob Soboroff at NBC has done so much work on the plight of people trying to flee and enter this country, so the media is a bit of a broad brush term. I think you mean the sort of what I would call opinion places or propaganda places that are agitating, not necessarily real news. We've been painted with too broad a brush in this country by the previous administration and the ongoing. So I like to make it clear that there's media and media, and it has to be distinguished. Barbara,
absolutely,
I know.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I would love to just show one other picture that I put on the PowerPoint of Nikki and then Alf Dubs, just to knock this message home, which is a lovely picture that I use. So this picture of Nikki with a kind in 1939, not one of his, but one who came on an earlier transport, but it's the only picture we have of him with a kinder, and it's very famous. And the picture in the middle is of him with one of the children he rescued, who is Lord Alf Dubs, who we've mentioned, who is responsible for an amendment to the Immigration Act in Britain, allowing unaccompanied refugee children who are stuck in camps in Europe into the UK. And on the far side is a picture of Alf with Ishmael, the first Syrian child refugee who came into this country under the Dubs Amendment. So to me, this is a lovely picture of the chain of history handing down from one generation to the next, that urge to do something to help others in a similar position and in need.
Wonderful pictures.
Yes. So I'm just looking at the clock, and I think, Tamara, maybe it's time to hand our program back to you.
Sure. Let me ask, I think we do have just a few more minutes. Let me ask one question someone asked here. Do we know how many people are alive today due to Nicky Winton?
Well, I use a very conservative estimate of about 6,000 to 7,000, but other people have suggested it's more. But I think that's a kind of reasonable, I think times 10 is a kind of reasonable working out based on what I've seen other people use for the whole Kindertransport. So yeah, I think about 7,000 we would say.
Very good. Well, I just want to thank all of you, all three of you, as well as I know we have a number of other Holocaust survivors and Kindertransport survivors in our group today, and also children of Kindertransport survivors and of Holocaust survivors. I just want to thank everyone for coming today, and especially Barbara and Kim. Thank you so much for just speaking today, to speaking together, telling your stories, telling Nicky's story, and also talking about the legacy that the two of you share through Barbara's father. And Eva, thank you so much for coming up as well, one of Nicky's children. I'm going to hand this back to Lisa at this point. Lisa, I think you wanted to say a few words.
Yes, thank you. And I have to admit that I am a little bit speechless. This has been such an impactful discussion, and seeing the video of all the people that are here today because of Sir Nicky absolutely gave me chills and filled my eyes with tears to see so many people impacted by such heroism. As Tamara said, there are a number of survivors. I did see some of your comments in the chat. Survivors and descendants of survivors, people on the Kindertransport, whether you were rescued or not, please reach out to us. These discussions are so important. We all get so much out of it. We're very interested in hearing your story and featuring your story on a future program. So please do reach out to us. It really is unimaginable to me to even consider that my very existence may not have happened. As Kim so eloquently said, the world needed Sir Nicholas Winton. There are so many golden nuggets that all of us have taken from this beautiful and incredible story. Here at the museum, we are so focused on making a difference and really driving home the fact that every person has the capacity to do something good. And that really came through loud and clear during this presentation. We do have so many ongoing crises happening today, and we really appreciate the message that we all need to look a little bit more closely at this story to truly understand that not only can we take action, but we need to take action. So on behalf of our entire team, we are so thankful to you, Kim, to you, Barbara, to you, Tamara, and to you, Eva, for being with us today. Thank you doesn't seem like enough, but it's what I've got right now. So thank you so much. To everyone who is in attendance, thank you all for being here. Very shortly, you will receive an email from us with a link to a survey. Your input is incredibly important to us. It does give us feedback, and it provides input into the types of programs that we have. Also in that email will be the instructions on how you can watch the recording of this program. Because it was so amazing, we really urge you, please forward this on to your family and friends so that more people can have the experience of hearing this incredible message delivered by this group of very passionate and powerful women. If you did enjoy the conversation today, we hope you'll join us for our next In My Own Words, which is taking place on July 11th at 3:00 p.m. That's a Sunday. So imagine for a second that you're writing a book about your grandfather and you're thinking that he was a war hero. But through your research, you come to find that that was not the case. He was actually a war criminal, a Nazi. That's what happened to author Sylvia Foti. She's going to share the story of how her entire mindset had to shift. So don't miss this unimaginable story. On a final note, these programs are presented to everyone at no cost. However, they do take a significant number of resources to produce. I'm very thankful for the team that we have here. Serena and Rachel, thank you so much. And Kathy and Lauren and Arden and Leilani and Stephen. We thank those of you who made a donation upon registration. If you had the opportunity to do so, thank you so much for your gift. And if you didn't, you'll see that there will be a link in the email that is being posted in the chat, and that will also, be in that email. So to everyone, thank you all again for being with us for this very inspiring program, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.